Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Merci d'être ici avec nous aujourd'hui. I'm Goran Pesek, Deputy Summit Chair and President and CEO of Samuel Associates and Executive Chair of the Policy Insights Forum. We are very pleased today to welcome you to Day 2 of our Summit on the Digitalization of Defense and Security, both online and in person here from Ottawa, Canada. We're also delighted to be collaborating with our Summit partner, Canadian Defence Review, and its publisher, Brett Kitchen. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce our Summit moderator who will guide our discussions on Day 2 with our industry executives covering this important theme, Lieutenant General Retired Michel Maisonneuve. General Maisonneuve, please take the podium. La parole est à vous.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, ici à Ottawa et aussi virtuellement à plusieurs autres endroits. On behalf of Goran and Brett Kitchen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Day 2 of our Digitalization of Defense and Security Summit. Tel que discuté hier, notre événement s'avère être une initiative permettant l'étude de la digitalisation de la défense et de la sécurité et d'échanger sur le sujet. En particulier, aujourd'hui, nous entendons comparer l'approche prônée par les entreprises civiles qui font également face à la digitalisation comme les gouvernements. First thing I'd like to do is apologize for some of the glitches we had yesterday, the technical glitches, and I think we've resolved those today, or I certainly hope we have. And thank you for hanging in there for those that did. The other thing is yesterday, because of some technical issues, some of our participants were unable to see the NATO video of the Deputy Secretary General. So we are going to run it again this morning as an introduction because it really sets the scene for the rest of the day today. So could I ask that the video be run, please?
No one knows what happens next, what the future holds.
Which events will shape us?
And which will test our resolve.
Times have changed, you see.
People too.
We need to stick together if we're going to make it through. Sticking together means an alliance of minds and hearts, a collection of individuals greater than the sum of its parts.
People of all different kinds, with different sets of skills that come together and align. Because freedom is what matters.
It is why we must stand tall, and it's why we always tell them,
all for one and one for all.
Alors, bonjour, Monsieur le Secrétaire général délégué. Merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté de nous parler aujourd'hui en préparation de notre sommet sur la digitalisation de la défense et de la sécurité. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer some questions, and I guess we'll go right into it, Mr. Joanna. Our summit today and tomorrow is going to bring together Western political, military, and industry leaders to discuss the convergence of digital and cyber technologies and their effect on the defense and security of NATO, of countries, and of private business. As we've seen, disruptive technologies are transforming the geopolitics of liberal Western democracies and affecting economies and business. Strategic competitors such as Russia and China are devoting more time and effort to operations in this new and current domain. So from your point of view, how does NATO see these emerging threats within the cyber domain?
Tout d'abord, merci pour l'invitation. Toujours heureux d'être avec nos alliés, amis canadiens. You're right, General. The threat from new technologies, including cyber, is real and significant. And the pandemic, we also have seen unprecedented number of people that have been doing more or less everything online. So malicious cyber activities target our people, as you mentioned, our businesses, and ultimately our societies, especially open democratic societies like ours. And they undermine the trust in democratic processes and institutions. So we have seen also during the pandemic ransomware attacks on hospitals and other healthcare services, including in the Czech Republic or France or Germany. We all remember vividly, and we still process the implications of the attack on SolarWinds, led to backdoor inserted into a huge number of companies and government agencies around the world. Also in Canada, just last week, a significant data breach was reported with one official colleague in I quote, the largest cyber attack in Newfoundland and Labrador's history, and among the largest in Canada. So cyber threats and new technologies are introducing a world where NATO, as the #1 alliance in human history, we are basically, in a way, called to adapt, to adjust, and act. Because the complex, destructive, coercive implications of technologies and cyber are becoming more frequent. In a way, it's a sort of a new normal in its abnormal way. As our societies and our militaries depend on this digital framework, it is vital that we all do anything we can to secure our networks and digital infrastructure. Because you have rightly described in your presentation, General, that the convergence between digitalization and cybersecurity technologies is something which is very much to my heart. I chair in NATO on behalf of Secretary General Stoltenberg, the Innovation Board in NATO. I'm also running the cyber adaptation effort here in NATO. And just recently, we have adopted a new AI strategy. Our defense ministers adopted just 2 weeks ago the first AI strategy when it comes to NATO. So EDTs is something that something is very much with us. Let me bring back a little bit of history on how NATO has started to look at cyber very, very attentively. So we have declared in NATO cyber as an operational domain, and you, with your track record in the leadership of NATO on our military side, you know this very well, the significance for NATO to declare cyber as an operational domain back in 2016 at the NATO summit in Warsaw. And ever since, we have continued to adapt. We are now preparing a cyber defense strategy. Some nations, like Canada, are also offering to NATO some of their national assets on cyber. And we are working on a continuum on the way to the next NATO summit in Madrid in June of next year into a comprehensive transformation and a roadmap for NATO to be up to the task of doing a few things to resist and quickly recover from any cyber attack. You all know, and probably the ones viewing our interview also do know, that our leaders have also decided that a severe cyber attack could be interpreted under the Article 5 rubric, which means that we have to make sure that this continuum of threats is very well managed by us here in NATO. So how to deter, how to defend against, and how to counter all these threats is something very much we do here at NATO. So resilience of our cyber defenses, resilience of our critical infrastructure, resilience of our supply chains, reducing vulnerabilities is something that we do. And let me say something about digitalization and the future. It is clear that new technologies are changing the very essence of warfare in a way and in a speed like never before in history. So as also our militaries will rely on this digital backbone in order to do what we are supposed to be doing, to protect against any threat from any direction, from any actor. The 1 billion people living in the 30 allied free democratic nations in NATO. This means that we'll have to work not only across a 360 geographical distribution of threats, and we see many of those coming from multiple directions, but also across domains. So to work across domains, air, land, sea, cyberspace, and space, which was also recognized in 2019 as the fifth operational domain, we'll have to have in NATO, and our militaries will need, a digital backbone. This means that we have to redouble our efforts to protect against cyber attacks and malign attempts to disrupt the way in which we run the business of defending our peoples. So I'm very happy that you asked this question, because the intersection between cyber and digitalization is probably, if you want, the essence of this transformative process that NATO is embarking upon, and where countries like Canada and all the other allies are doing lots of things. You also develop as Canada, and we're watching this with great interest, and we support this and encourage our great ally in Canada to develop its cyber capacities. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, launched in 2018, is already world recognized. We also appreciate a lot that Prime Minister Trudeau highlighted the fact that Canada would provide cyber effects to NATO. So this is something that we have to do as an alliance. And I close in saying that we know, this is not new, but this is with us even more intensely than ever before, that we are as strong as our weakest link. So that's why we have to make sure that all allies, big and small, more, let's say, stronger economically, and sometimes a little bit less, that we enhance our resilience to cyber threats across the board, across the 30 ally nations.
Thank you. And obviously the heads of state and nations see this as important, because I guess it was discussed at the summit in June and was part of the declaration from the summit. And so how can NATO encourage nations to do this, to react to these threats?
Listen, we've been doing what we call the cyber pledge exercise in NATO since 2016, when I mentioned that cyber was declared and we are working with cyber as an operational domain in NATO. This means that on an annual basis, allies are, on a voluntary basis, they are measuring themselves against a set of requirements on cyber defense and cyber resilience, a process which is very, very rewarding for all allies, the larger one, the ones in North America, the ones here in Europe. And this is a way for us to have a growing common threshold for cyber resilience, cyber defense, and cyber adaptation. We also do something which is quite interesting. We organize on an annual basis the largest cyber exercise in the world. Why we do this? First of all, because we are 30 nations, so that's already a lot of nations that are working together, but also because we work with NATO's partners. You mentioned the international rule-based order. We are the most important and successful alliance and powerful alliance in human history, but we know that we have to enhance with like-minded nations, with other democratic nations, with countries that can bring their expertise in a two-way street with NATO ever closer together. I remember vividly one of our many exchanges and intelligence sharing with, I'll give you an example, our NATO Asia-Pacific partners, what we call the AP4, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, on cyber threats. So this is also helping us not only across the Atlantic, in Europe and North America, but actually around the world, to build a shared strategic awareness and also together to enhance our deterrence. So that's massive work, and we are committed in continuing on the way to our next NATO summit. You mentioned the last summit we had in June here in Brussels, but we have a very ambitious agenda that our Madrid summit in 2022, our leaders will adopt even more comprehensive, ambitious, and forward-looking cyber defense strategy.
Excellent. And so one of the things that we're going to discuss tomorrow at our summit is we'll gather a panel of industry leaders to seek their views on digitalization and the threat to private business. What is the NATO approach to relations with private industry in defending digitalization infrastructure and critical assets?
NATO is an alliance of democracies. So engaging with our own societies, with public sector, with private sector, with academia and civil society is of the essence. Also have to take into account that in the last few decades, most of the innovation, most of the technologies are today produced not only in governments or in public institutions, but when it comes to new technologies, I think that more than 80% are invented and put on the market by the private sector. So if we want to harness the number one competitive advantage of our alliance when it compares to nations that are proposing more authoritarian or totalitarian approaches on how to organize human societies, we are in a way called, obliged, and eager to engage with our private sectors. From a practical standpoint, because they produce most of the technology that we are also using in defense and security, but also because we need to educate each other on the needs that we have, and also to be of help in trying to encourage the private sector to also look into account on issues that are the responsible use of new technologies when it comes to AI or big data or quantum computing or biotechnology. This is why we also work with private sector in all 30 nations. I mentioned that I'm chairing the innovation board in NATO. We do this on a very constant basis. You served in Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk as Chief of Staff a few years ago, General. So you know that we also have a strategic command on new technologies. They are also engaging with private sector. Our specialized agencies are also working with the private sector. And this week we'll be organizing in Rome the NATO Industry Forum, when many of the defense and technology firms will be present and will be engaging with us at the top level of the alliance. Let me say just one word, because in having this innovation ecosystem between public, private, and academia in NATO countries, I mentioned, I believe, and this is a fact, is our number one competitive asset in comparison with our competitors. But we also have to harness the issues that are put by other partners, other than nations, like the European Union. European Union has developed a toolbox of instruments that are very useful. A number of allies are also member states of the EU. I'm also working, and NATO is working also the UN. I was just in Geneva, the agencies that are there that are working on standard setting. And we have to make sure that the norms, the standards, and hopefully universal legislation around new technologies and international norms could and should be developed, having at their heart also if you want, the commercial interest of the private sector, but also the values and the ethical thrust that we have to embed in everything we do. And I'm very proud, as I mentioned, that NATO is one of the first big important international organizations that have developed this AI strategy. And if you pay a little bit of attention and you read the AI strategy from NATO, you'll be seeing probably for the first time the recognition of responsible use and also the recognition of the ethical norms when it comes to the security applications of AI and big data. So we need the private sector. We engage with the private sector, and I think we will be in the position to do even more in making sure that we are aligned in sync. And also our new, if you want, transatlantic initiatives on new technologies, Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, that will have one regional headquarters in North America, another one here in Europe, are also trying to do just that, to create for the private sector, also for the SMEs, for the promising startups, a place where they can use our testing centers of NATO allies, some of our sandboxes, and also to allow them, in a way, minimizing the cost of failure and optimizing the successful technologies. And on top of that, we are also launching a NATO innovation fund that will be also helping these companies that have bright ideas for dual use and make sure that we nurture the talent of the private sector, which is the number one asset of what we have as open societies and democratic societies in NATO and in a democratic world.
Dr. Joanna, you're actually answering questions before I pose them. I like that very much. Let me just kind of finish with one of my particular, what I think is one of NATO's greatest accomplishments, and that is interoperability. And you mentioned standards. NATO's always been a champion of interoperability, in my view, and all nations, even those that do not belong currently to NATO, tend to use NATO standards for their operations and tactics. And what's so then to close off, how do you see the importance of interoperability in the digital domain?
You're so much right, General. We are such a successful alliance because of our values, because of our shared interests, but also because we can work, exercise, plan, and act together. So interoperability is, if you want, the essential part of what we do. So it's very clear that as we are moving into the adoption of new technologies in the way in which we conduct the business of keeping our 1 billion people safe against any threat from any direction, from any domain, we'll have to make sure that we keep interoperability very much on the agenda, because we have to recognize not all allies have the same depth of their innovation ecosystem, the same depth of their financial and venture capital markets, or the same depth or endowments of their universities. That's a fact. And that's the beauty of NATO. Because through our defense planning processes, through our exercising together through Diana, as I mentioned, and to many other things that we do, we are making sure that all allies are today and tomorrow able to operate, function, deploy, and God forbid, fight together. So this is why the adoption of new technologies across the board is something which is so important. This is why our military leaders are working on a specific new technologies strategy that is already on the way towards implementation. So when we speak about NATO, you know, when it comes to security, NATO is the gold standard when it comes to defense and security. And we are very much keen in keeping interoperability and making sure that not only NATO, but also many of our partners, as you mentioned, General, they're adopting, even short of a partnership with NATO, our way to do command and control, to prepare for exercises, to train their military and security forces, because NATO is the gold standard. It is the utmost ambition and obligation of us here in NATO to make sure that interoperability remains the core ingredient for making sure that all 30 allies and our militaries will be able also in the future to act together as one, as Article 5 says, one for all and all for one.
Well, Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for your time. And I'll just close off by reminding our panel and our folks that you recently participated in the 10th GoTech World Conference. And your words at that time spoke about the importance of bytes and big data, which has become as great as bullets and battleships. And so I thank you very much. Je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir pris le temps de nous parler aujourd'hui et au plaisir de vous rencontrer un moment. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous et bonne chance à votre très importante conférence. Thank you so much and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a great day.
Thank you.
So that was an excellent explanation and background to our conference both yesterday and today. Je voudrais dire merci encore une fois au secrétaire général délégué pour sa participation et sa réponse aux questions et son approche très claire à la digitalisation. Yesterday, we discussed the impact of the digital domain on the military political realm, where nations and NATO are creating organizations and developing policies to deal with the issue. But individuals can also affect supply chains and influence social activities. As mentioned by the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, just 3 weeks ago, Newfoundland and Labrador were hit by a cyber attack that disrupted the healthcare system and resulted in the theft of employee data. One of the healthcare regional authorities, in fact, was only able to run emergency services for a period of time. A similar attack in May knocked out Ireland's healthcare system for days. And even now, some editorials of very liberal newspapers are starting to call for a national cyber defense strategy, so even media are worried. Large multinational companies now need to ensure their databases and information are better protected than ever, as non-state actors have no boundaries. So it will be very interesting to get the views of our guests today who represent a cross-section of private industry. Before we go on, once again, I want to thank our title sponsors, NATO and Thales, our sponsors, Calian, General Dynamics Mission Systems, Dafocom Solutions, and Neptune, and our technology partners, Modest Tree and Distantly. Thank you for your support in helping make this important summit happen. Merci beaucoup à nos commanditaires. Encore une fois, j'aimerais souligner la densité de notre programme pour aujourd'hui. La même ou une meilleure discipline qu'hier assurera que notre sommet fonctionne correctement et que tous nos intervenants ont la chance de faire valoir leur point de vue. So there's a bit of a change in the program today. Our Boeing colleague was unable at the last minute to join us, so we'll have 4 panelists instead of 5. However, this morning we're really very fortunate to have with us Mr. Goldie Hyder, the President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. The Council is a non-profit, non-partisan organization representing the chief executives and heads of 150 leading Canadian businesses, employing 1.7 million Canadians, and composed of every major industry across the country. Ancien président et chef de la direction de Hill & Knowlton Strategies Canada, M. Hyder possède aussi une longue expérience au service de plusieurs organismes de bienfaisance et sans but lucratif. De plus, il siège au conseil consultatif de 2 organisations de premier plan promouvant l'avancement des femmes dans le milieu des affaires, Catalyst Canada et le Club 30% Canada. Mr. Hyder is a regular commentator in the Canadian media on business, politics, and leadership, and you may have seen his comments yesterday on the Prime Minister's visit to D.C. For the so-called Three Amigos meeting. We're very glad also that he's agreed to take a couple of questions actually at the end, so I'd ask you to prepare a couple of questions here from the audience in person, and we'll get a chance to get the response to his answers to those questions. Mr. Hyder, we look forward to your comments.
Well, good morning, everyone. I was willing to yield my time to the last panel, given that they pretty much confirmed what I hope to share with you this morning about the importance of this relationship. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's my privilege to have been asked to make really an opening statement to help set the stage for the second day of your program. And, il me fait grand plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. We gather at a time of unprecedented change, from rising populism and aging populations to COVID-19 and, of course, climate change. There's frankly no shortage at all of disruptive forces challenging our social, our economic, and frankly, our very way of living. So this morning, I want to talk to you about really just 3 drivers of change and how I feel and we feel that they're reshaping our understanding of national security and the risks we face. So these 3 sources of disruption are the rapid digitalization of the global economy, the growing economic and technological rivalry between China and the United States, and the reemergence of industrial policy. So how we as leaders in business, government, and defense choose to respond to such changes will matter significantly. So let me start with the first one, the rapid digitalization of the global economy. Perhaps the understatement of the day will be the world as we know is changing. One of the most fundamental drivers of that is digital transformation. La technologie numérique transforme nos vies, êtres, façon de vivre. At its core, digital transformation is about using the latest technology to do what you already do, just better. It's about replacing slower manual processes with faster digital ones. And the global economy is undergoing digital transformation at breakneck speed. According to the World Bank, the digital economy is growing 2.5 times faster than the overall global economy. And the same situation is playing out here at home. Over the past decade, Canada's digital economy grew roughly 40% faster and generated almost 4 times as many jobs as the overall economy. And that's saying a lot when you consider the makeup of our economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has only accelerated this trend. In just a few months' time, COVID has brought about decades worth of investments in digital technologies as companies accelerated their long-term digital strategies to respond to the crisis. And so just as the Industrial Revolution brought about enormous benefits for society through the spread of labor-saving technologies, the unfolding digital revolution has the potential to do the same. It can help companies reach new markets, new buyers, make products faster, and make them more efficiently, and improve not only customer or consumer convenience, but choice and value. However, digital technologies' promise will ultimately depend on how the short term is managed. Like the Industrial Revolution before, the digital revolution presents new risks to the functioning of our economies and societies. And one of the most pervasive and destructive risks are cyber attacks. As international interactions shift into cyberspace, we've seen skyrocketing levels of cybercrime, state-sponsored attacks against critical infrastructure, and the theft of invaluable intellectual property. Cyber attacks don't just threaten the viability of businesses. They also disrupt the services that citizens rely upon daily. This year's assault on healthcare facilities provides a timely example. To think about it, at the height of the pandemic, facilities across the country were overwhelmed by a series of attacks disrupting medical services and putting patients' safety at risk. The second item I mentioned is the rise of China and its economic and technological rivalry with the United States. And this is frankly the defining driver of change in the changing world order. Le monde est très différent aujourd'hui par rapport à les 50 ans. The unipolar moment that prevailed following the end of the Cold War is giving way to a new geopolitical reality marked by China's rise as an economic and technological competitor to the United States. As my friend Ian Bremmer says, we are living in a G0 world. And in this challenging environment, national security is no longer an issue limited to far-flung parts of the world. It is now shaping global trade flows. It's shaping the flows, it's shaping the rules, it's shaping investment patterns, and frankly, as we heard earlier, shaping innovation. And so as a nation that has been sheltered from most threats in recent decades, I would suggest this is a real wake-up call for Canada. I mean, if you can attack Newfoundland, what's safe? One of the new threats we face in the weaponization of our economic dependence on others. As Canada knows well, economic dependence can expose our country to serious economic harm and, in the case, a breakdown of political relations. The bifurcation of the US and Chinese economies also poses serious risks to Canada and its prosperity. A fragmented world makes operating on a global scale quite difficult for Canadian businesses. When data, software, or semiconductor technology cannot move across borders because of legal barriers, or when computers or phones made by one country's companies can't talk to another country's companies, it frankly impacts Canada's ability to compete globally. Finally, the return of industrial policy. Enfin, nous constatons un nouvel intérêt pour la politique industrielle. Out of fashion for some time, industrial policy is now once again reshaping our world. Motivated by geopolitical competition and a COVID-inspired push towards self-sufficiency, governments around the world are making massive investments in new technologies to support strategic industries. For instance, the EU has been pushing for what they call European strategic autonomy, a plan that will make EU more resilient and influential on the world stage. You might have seen just yesterday the global CEO of Alliance in France had talked about the need for an industrial policy. At the heart of the plan is developing greater digital sovereignty, which will require massive investments in fields of data, AI, the Internet of Things, as well as exploring regulatory power, the famous Brussels effect to make Europe a digital powerhouse. The race to dominate the new general purpose technologies such as electric batteries, 5G telecommunication equipment, and AI is frankly changing the global competitiveness landscape. These technologies are driving disruptive innovation across the range of economic sectors, from finance and manufacturing to agriculture and retail. The industrial race that's being pursued by the major economies creates risks for Canada and our long-term prosperity. A weak innovation performance places Canada at risk of being disrupted rather than being the disruptor. So we should have reason to be concerned. Canada starts from a position of weakness in R&D spending, IP commercialization, and talent retention. Further, we can hardly match the scale of new financial support being committed in major economies. And we tend, when we do invest, given the Federation, to spread it all around with very little focus, and the outcomes often are small, because that's what happens when you think small and invest small. So what's needed? Digitization, geopolitics, industrial policy, these drivers of change will have significant and long-lasting consequences for Canada and her allies. They necessitate a serious reflection on how we define national security and address the emerging risks that we face. And given the nature of these changes, our understanding of national security must widen. It must widen from traditional areas of concern to include economic interactions. In the modern era, there is no clear dividing line between civil and military spheres. National security is, frankly, everything and everywhere. The question now is, what do we need to do, and how do we need to do it? Frankly, we probably know, I'm sure you of all people know, what it is that needs to be done. Business and government will need to work more collaboratively to address growing cyber threats. We just heard that 80% of the innovation that takes place occurs with the private sector. We need to tackle Canada's growing cyber skills shortage to ensure that organizations have the capacity to defend against attacks. Just look at countries. Japan is teaching AI to kids in junior high school. Right? How much of our curriculums have we changed in our education system? What's still being taught versus what needs to be taught? And at the same time, government, as well as businesses, will need to do a better job of sharing cyber threat intelligence so that we can stay on top of the threat. Because as you well know, speed to respond is everything. There's no point if you figured it out late. So Canada is an open, and we must remain so, trade-dependent economy, also must learn to navigate the new and potentially treacherous international order. What we've called, sort of in the government calls, the eyes wide open approach to the geopolitical environment in which we operate. Canada needs this approach to China and, frankly, the United States as well, as we've seen over the last 10, 11 months. Things are really changing globally, and what was isn't anymore. And we may well be on our own in figuring out how to navigate this new world order. And so regardless of political trends, both countries, China and the United States, are going to feature significantly in our economic future. This isn't either or, it's and beyond that in terms of our broader strategy into the Indo-Pacific and our trade agreements in Europe and other places. And so at the same time, though, as I'm saying, we should continue to build and enhance partnerships with these like-minded partners. The TPP offers us access to, a half a billion people. It includes Japan, Japan, and Vietnam, and other countries that we can consider doing work with and sharing the responsibilities that I'm speaking of today. That this doesn't just fall on the Five Eyes or just the United States or just others. There are a lot of other actors out there that we should be thinking about how to partner with. And amongst them, I mentioned Japan, but I'll also throw in the entire EU itself, where again, another 500 million people we have access to with our trade agreement, and the United Kingdom, with whom we're probably going to have a formal trade agreement bilaterally, but we pretty much have one today. These are all nations that we can work with to protect our collective well-being as we go forward. So on the one hand, we may be at it alone, but we're not really alone. We need to have friends around the world to help us. And so the government, we feel, needs to develop a new, much more intentional, much more deliberate industrial policy. It should be aimed at ensuring that Canada has the wherewithal to provide for our future needs. What I said earlier about spreading around what's known as the peanut butter approach to make sure everybody gets a taste is not the way to go about approaching innovation. Innovation cannot benefit from resources being spread out too widely. You actually have to pick some lanes. You actually have to know what you're good at and double down on that, because that is going to be why countries are going to look to you to say, we know that here's what Canada can offer. And so while I'm not going to answer which lane to do here, that's something that governments and others are all going to have to work with. They should know that they have a partner in the business community and the industrial heartlands of this country to work together to help figure that out. Because, as I said, what got us here is not going to get us where we're going. We're going to have to change something. And that partnership between business and government is going to be key. We can help them figure out what it is that we need to double down on, and we can support the fast-growing sectors where the country has a global competitive advantage. We talk about ag tech, we talk about biotech, we talk about clean tech, we talk about fintech. And there's a lot of opportunities in this country, starting with the fact that we have a track record of really embracing immigrants to this country. People can be one of our greatest resources in addition to our natural resources. And so we've certainly been stressing people, innovation, and ideas as sort of foundational pillars for how to grow our economy as we look forward to the next 150 years. And that means policy matters. The previous panelists were talking about, if I remember correctly, 80% from the private sector, and that the importance of the collaboration between governments and the private sector, between NATO and the private sector, other institutions and organizations in the private sector. Policies matter when you think about that. Private sectors exist in lots of parts of the world, but the policies that attract the capital, the policies that provide the access to talent, the policies that bring about a predictable, stable regulatory framework that one can rely on, not from election to election, but for the longer haul. Many of you are, in some cases, global companies who choose Canada because hopefully we're providing you with some predictability and stability. I think we can do better. And I think we're going to need to do better as we go forward. And so these policy choices themselves are the drivers of innovation. And we feel very strongly that Canada can compete, Canada must compete, and it will succeed only if business, government, and your industries work together to help make the right choices and set the country on the right path to deal with the new global order within which we live. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very, very enlightening, and it sets us up perfectly for the rest of our day. Now, I'm going to take two questions here for Mr. Hyder. So, could I have the first question? Because we don't have microphones in the audience, if you please speak loudly, and as necessary, I will paraphrase for Mr. Hyder. Question, anybody? Yeah.
Hi. Good morning. Thank you for your comments. You mentioned about. I will characterize your words as invest with focus. And yet, I'm understandably not willing to say, and it ought to be these three things. But what would give Canada an asymmetric advantage that would allow you to think this is the place we ought to focus on?
Great question, and a fair one. I think the first thing that comes to mind whenever I'm thinking about this issue is, what is the challenge of our time? And the challenge of our time today is climate change. It is crossing all forms of geography. It is crossing all types of governments. It is showing no mercy to anybody anywhere in the world. And so to me, climate change can perhaps be a glue to bring down the divisions that exist between the United States and China and other parts of the world, to say, this is really something we're all in it together on. I mean, there's all that hashtag about Build Back Better and we're in it together. This one is true. We're actually in this together here. And so I think innovation opportunities for Canada, being a natural resource economy, but also being a human resource economy. You know, we don't have an actual stated vision for the country. Our brand around the world is effectively testing as nice, which I say is great if you're a cookie, but not so great if you're trying to compete with these other countries that are trying to attract your capital, talent from different parts of the world. I mean, look, there is never going to be a shortage of people who want to come to Canada. What you got to ask yourself, what we got to ask ourselves is it who we want and is it who we need? And that means they're looking at what opportunities are here from them. And this goes back to the message of policy matters. We need to do better, not just on the innovation. I got this 5 eyes, which I know you all would like, but it's not the 5 eyes you think. I may not be able to rattle them all off here, but it's not just about innovation. It's also about our immigration policy. It's about our infrastructure in policy. In this country, it's about our Indigenous relations, right? And it is about having an industrial policy that we're going to be able to sell to the rest of the world and market as, when you come to Canada, yes, you have access to look, we have 11 of the world's 35 critical minerals. You know, our neighbor thinks they belong to them as well. Actually, they're ours. And we need to make sure we assert our sovereignty in that regard. So when we're negotiating with them about some of the things that they're just doing to us on the EV batteries and stuff like that, remind them that these resources are not yours, they're ours. And for you to have access to them, we need to have collaboration, cooperation, consistency, and a framework in which we're working as friends, not every other day looking over my back saying, wham, here comes another tariff. You know, and so I think we've got to do everything we can on the climate change issue, because it is where President Biden is, it is where President Xi is, it's where Prime Minister Modi is, it's where President Macron is, and it's certainly where Prime Minister Trudeau is. So it's a leadership opportunity for Canadian government and business to work together beyond the rhetoric, beyond the the commitments that get made and targets that get set. How are we going to do that? What is that path? How much investment is necessary? What kind of brain power is necessary? How long is this journey going to be? And how much is it going to cost our citizens as we go through all this? It's time to be serious about this issue and to do so in a way in which that brings people along, as opposed to politicizing it as you're either with us or against us. I really believe strongly that climate change can be that starting point. Obviously, there are things around defense. You know, when you've got the territory that we do, but we've relied so heavily on the United States on this. Their beef with us, as you all well know, is largely one of, you got to spend more. And so we've got to have the money to do that, but that means having the priorities to do that. And as you've seen, when you have too many priorities, you have none, or when you have no priorities, you definitely have none. And so we've got to help focus that.
You end up with a peanut butter approach.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of peanut butter to begin with, so yeah.
Other question? Yes.
You speak about policy, and policy is good. What we lack and what we quite often hear is a lack of strategy. And we've heard, most, I think, vividly over the last couple of years, certainly during the pandemic, a need for sector strategy. So you've got tangibles, i.e. aerospace, defense, and health and whatnot. What about cyber? How does one deal with a cyber strategy as an intangible, and how do you promote that through government?
Yeah, another great question. And I should mention one of my eyes that I left out, which is critical to all of this, is investment. We need to have an environment that allows for investment to happen so that the things that I talked about earlier can take place. I actually think this is also a low-hanging fruit for Canada. Our AI reputation in different parts of the world is actually quite strong, from Edmonton to Toronto and Montreal. There are developing capacities in that space. Quantum. quantum technologies can be a real game changer for lots of reasons, including cybersecurity. If you think about how it would respond to threats, that's also happening in Canada. The challenge for us, and this is a subject for a whole other speech that I give quite regularly, it's about our culture. As Canadians, we've been really comfortable. We've been really complacent because it's kind of been easy to be Canada. Right, 75 years the British took care of us, and 75 years the Americans took care of us. We're surrounded in 75% of the way with water. There's no real neighbors to worry about or anything. And it's allowed us, and by the way, when I say us, I'm talking about the holistic us. Right, all of us, including business and others, have said it's kind of easy to do business in America. Right, they're right there, big market, billions of dollars goes across, on a regular basis here. But now we have to wake up and realize that, as I said earlier, what was isn't anymore. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do they want from us? What value can we add? How can we bring them along for the journey? I used to work for the Right Honorable Joe Clark, who always said, the way it works with the Americans is you got to take things to them. You got to come up with solutions for problems that they have that actually helps you as well. That's how acid rain happened, and the treaty happened. That's how free trade happened. So many other things that we were able to bring to them. So we have to ask ourselves today, at a time in which America is, with the greatest respect to those of you who are, appears to be going through a near-death experience and really breaking up into different parts and pieces, what can we do to help? Because we can't change geography. They're going to be in the neighborhood. What can we do to help them solve some of the problems that they're facing? And what are they looking to from us? One of them might well be improved capacity to assist with cyber. And I think we have that capacity and we should invest in it.
Okay, I'll take one more question. One more. A short one. No, I think we're good. Mr. Hyder, thank you so much for your comments. This was very useful. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. I wish you all very well. Thank you.
Alors, merci beaucoup pour ces remarques et ça nous permet de bien comprendre l'environnement industriel en relation avec la digitalisation. Alors maintenant, mesdames et messieurs, nous allons procéder avec nos collègues et les entreprises invitées. Comme vous l'avez vu dans le programme, nous avons l'honneur d'accueillir 4 invités dans le domaine des affaires qui nous permettront de comprendre l'impact de la digitalisation. Our guests today are senior executives in their respective industries who will be able to give us a great view of the impact of digitalization, the threats and opportunities for their companies. I want to thank each and every one of you for your time and comments. Like yesterday, the detailed biographies of our guests can be found at the Poly Insights Forum website where you registered for the summit. But I'll nevertheless briefly introduce each speaker before their presentation, after which they'll provide about 10 minutes of opening comments. At the end of the opening statements, we'll have a short break to be followed by a roundtable where the participants will field questions we received from our audience when they registered for the summit. We have 2 participants here in person and 2 online who we'll go to. So, alors notre premier conférencier est Monsieur Kevin Ford, who is a president and CEO of Calian Canada. Kevin Ford was promoted to Chief Executive Officer in April 2015. Kevin has worked in technology professional services for over 35 years. Prior to becoming CEO of Calian in April 2015, he served as Calian's Business and Technology Services Division President for over 4 years. He's worked for 11 years at IBM, where he was a partner in global business services and responsible for the Canadian Defense portfolio. Monsieur Ford, merci d'être ici. Je vous passe la parole.
Merci, Michel. Et bienvenue tout le monde. Ça me fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui avec vous, avec les dirigeants de la cybersécurité. J'apprécie beaucoup les perspectives des participants du Canada, l'OTAN et nos collègues. For those of you that don't know Calian, we are a very diverse organization that supports defense and national security programs in Canada, NATO, as well as private and public sector clients. We operate in the health, space, defense, and cyber and learning domains, all very relevant to the discussions over the last 2 days. As a publicly traded CEO, a good part of my role is working with my management team to identify and mitigate risk for our company, for our customers, for our shareholders. Clearly, cybersecurity is one of those risks that is high probability and high impact. It is not an if it happens, but when it happens. It is a common enemy to all enterprises, whether public or private, one that both government and industry spend billions on as we are all aware that those tools and processes that keep us safe today could have vulnerabilities tomorrow. What has been clear in the discussions during the last 2 days is we realize that this is not solely a defense and security issue. It is a threat to many of the elements we depend on every day, our healthcare systems, our power grids, our financial services, our daily life. I want to circle back on a few topics that have been discussed over the last 2 days. The Deputy Secretary General talked to the concept of deter, defend, and counter. My government colleague from Canada, Mr. Burt, talked about culture, technology, and procurement reform. The concept of physical threats versus digital threats, and a few of my own closing thoughts. Regarding deter, defend, and counter. In the deter area, we need to continue to share our experiences and failures to ensure we shut down vulnerabilities as quickly as they happen. Yesterday, I received a text message on my cell phone testing the emergency response messaging system that is primarily dealing with physical emergencies. How can we tune the emergency management system to alert of high-impact cyber attacks or vulnerabilities? Many organizations cannot afford extensive cybersecurity tools and warriors. How can we help them as we all realize we are only as strong as our weakest link? We continue to maneuver through COVID-19, where the world was updated daily on the threat of the virus, its location, its variants, and proper protocols to help deter the virus from spreading. What is our cyber equivalent of the World Health Organization? Do we need a World Cyber Organization? In the defend area, what industry can learn from defense and security organizations is how to prepare through mission rehearsal, exercises, simulation, cyber response. Even better, how do we collectively train to be ready for these emergencies? An annual cyber response exercise organized by NATO was mentioned. What can we do to leverage these experiences so that we can collectively learn how to work together? The one area that industry cannot do, however, is counter. We are in the boxing ring taking punches, and we can't punch back. We need our defense and security organizations to continue to find ways to take out the enemy, to defuse the missile before it lands. My Canadian colleague, Mr. Burt, talked to culture, technology, and procurement reform. His comments resonated with me. We are dealing with technology and an enemy that's running at 200 kilometers an hour. And we cannot continue to think processes that have been designed to run at 90 kilometers an hour can keep up. I have worked in both government and industry, and I know how hard everyone is working on adapting, changing, and trying to expedite procurement while dealing with public sector realities of fairness and good value for taxpayer. It is not easy, but we cannot give up. This is again where continued dialogue with industry and government is required to figure this out. I loved his sandbox idea. We heard with NATO as well, talking about co-collaboration. And we have I think industry, all the colleagues here would be happy to have discussions on how we make that happen. Regarding physical and digital threats, I do worry that we are building a high tolerance level for digital events. Over dinner last night, we talked about the pain threshold and how that threshold continues to get higher. Years ago, a cyber attacker event was major news and was few and far between. Today, it's a daily occurrence. And news of a healthcare system being attacked, as we saw recently in Newfoundland, is a passing comment in a news story. Think about it. For a few days, the ability to deliver healthcare was impacted by a cyber event. Had that attack been a physical event, had an enemy showed up on our coast, how would we reacted to that? In closing, I believe the summit and continued dialogue between industry, government, and defense organizations is critical. We need to continue to develop talent that can help us in the short term. You heard France yesterday reference going from 3,500 to 5,000 cybersecurity warriors. 5,000. That's one country. We need to co-collaborate on new tools and technologies such as AI. We need to train and rehearse how we work together when a high-impact cyber event occurs. We need to determine how we best inform our citizens on cyber. Through open collaboration, I am confident we can continue to make progress. I want to thank the organizers of the summit for bringing us together to discuss this very important topic. Merci for your attention. Stay safe. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, M. Ford, pour ces remarques très intéressantes. Puis j'ai aimé votre utilisation de la deter, defend, and counter. Our next speaker, our next guest is Emiliano Cargiman, who is Chief Executive Officer and founder of Satellogic from Argentina. Mr. Cargiman is a real entrepreneur, having founded a number of technology and high-tech companies. Satellogic is a leading provider of high-resolution satellite imagery to governments and commercial customers worldwide. Mr. Cargiman, you have the floor. À vous.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. And I have to say, in my previous career, before running a satellite company, I ran an information security company for 15 years. So I'm very familiar with some of the challenges around cybersecurity. For us at Satellogic, we are in the middle of a series of trends that I think are common to the digitalization that we're discussing and the cyber threats that we're discussing. On one side, we are building a constellation of satellites to remap everything that's happening on Earth and collect data essentially in real time of everything happening on the planet. We're currently operating 17 satellites in orbit. We will be launching another over 200 satellites in the next few years to have a complete working constellation of 300 satellites by 2025, with the ability to take an image, a complete new image of every square foot of the surface of the Earth every single day, and deliver that to our customers everywhere in the world. And our customers are, as was mentioned, governments in many cases, and commercial companies that use this data to inform their decision making. So we have a challenge for ourselves that has to do with how we share this infrastructure we're putting in low Earth orbit with our customers. Sharing infrastructure is always difficult. Space, in this sense, is moving through a process that the IT industry in general has moved through when going from central data centers and on-premises operations to the cloud. In space, this hasn't yet happened. Governments are mostly currently operating their own satellite infrastructure and using their own satellites and their own infrastructure to collect the data that they need. Now, in the next few years, as commercial companies like ourselves continue to launch more and more capacity in orbit, governments will have to figure out a way to utilize shared commercial infrastructure in orbit to collect the data that they need for daily decisions. And this is difficult. There are several challenges around sharing a system. Some of those can be attacked by known means, like end-to-end encryption, for example, and signing data in orbit to validate the source and the integrity of the data that's being delivered. But as counterintuitive as it might sound, most satellites that are being operated today in orbit don't have the capacity, the compute power to implement this very simple encryption techniques. And the reason for that is that the space industry in general is built to maximize the reliability of systems in orbit. And over time, what this has meant is that the technology that is being flown is technology that is relatively old. Satellites, traditional satellites, have development cycles that take around 10 years from the signboard to the satellite being in orbit. And they typically design with technology that has already been proven in orbit, right? Which means that when you're starting the design of these traditional satellites, you will use technology that already has done at least one cycle in orbit. So you're starting to design with technology that's already around 10 years old. So by the time the end of the life of the satellites comes, 10 years after they're in operation, you're essentially flying and operating technology that's 30 years old. And this is a big challenge, right? You cannot implement very simple things like end-to-end encryption and signature of packets in traditional satellite infrastructure. In our case, our satellites have a design cycle of around 8 months. We're flying new satellites every quarter. And we don't have this problem. We're flying satellites and they're built with current technology, which is something that other companies in the commercial side, particularly in the small satellite sector, have started to do. And this gives us at least the tools to start to address some of these problems of shared infrastructure in orbit. Now, on top of that, we have to understand the problematic. On top of that, we have to understand the problematic of upgrading the systems. Again, it wasn't the case that the operating system or the algorithms used by satellites were easily upgradable. A typical upgrade cycle for traditional Earth observation satellites or for traditional satellites that are currently operating in orbit typically takes several months. We're pushing the technology to put satellites, the infrastructure that will operate in orbit, in a continuous integration cycle so that we can integrate new algorithms and we can actually respond to threats as they're happening in real time, as we do with our infrastructure in the ground. But these are new things for the space industry and things that we will have to deal with and work with as an industry together. There are very few regulations yet in operating technology in low Earth orbit, and yet the impact of the technology that we operate in low Earth orbit is very significant. With the proliferation of satellites and as we have seen recently, even with anti-satellite tests, we have to really worry about the proliferation of debris, the proliferation of objects in orbit that will make it difficult or even impossible in the future to operate constellations such as ours. And this is one of the reasons why we have to take care of the infrastructure that we put out there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Kargiman. Very interesting in a completely different kind of sector with the satellites. We're happy now to welcome Ms. Angela Heise, Corporate Vice President for Defense and Intelligence of the Microsoft Corporation in the U.S. Ms. Heise has been in her current position since June. Her portfolio includes information technology and cybersecurity and transportation security. Ms. Heise, we look forward to hearing your comments. À vous.
Thank you, and good morning. First, I'd like to thank the Policy Insights Forum for putting on this event. I'd also like to thank the Canadian government, Department of National Defence, and the Canadian Armed Forces for your commitment to the promotion of global peace, security, and stability, and for the ongoing partnership with industry. We're here to talk about the convergence of digital and cyber technologies and their effect on defense and security. The global defense ecosystem is at an inflection point, with Canada, the US, and the allied defense community facing an incredibly complex and rapidly evolving threat landscape, the likes of which we've never seen before. Global stability is being challenged by adversaries, both old and new, and the theater and character of conflict itself is changing. It's a time when Canada is re-examining its strategic defense context while retaining its commitment to being strong at home, secure in North America, and engaged in the world. Everyone here is committed to the preservation of peace and support for Western democracy. And together, we are working to build a future-ready defense ecosystem that can mitigate this threat and preserve peace through joint strength. Given the speed at which the world is moving, we know that a future-ready defense force must be fast, it must be agile, it must be disruptive, and of course, it needs to be cyber-enabled. Tech intensity is really a factor that determines an organization or a country's success or failure. Its ability to develop new mission capability and the speed at which it can be accomplished. This is not just about technology development. More importantly, it's about technology adoption and the pace that you can adopt technology. We need to put new capability into the hands of decision makers, allies, and partners, and the operator when they need it. And in this digital era and battlefield, much of that new capability will be software-centric. We know data will be a strategic asset, and it needs to be shared and accessible in order to be valuable. At Microsoft, we help our defense customers through their digital transformation journeys by helping them truly harness data as a strategic asset, to elevate data into actionable insights and drive connectivity and information sharing for a more collaborative joint force. Of course, underlying all of that is the need for a digital backbone that's rooted in identity, compliance, and security. The defense ecosystem is charged with some of the most critical missions on the planet, and security is absolutely critical. It's non-negotiable. So that is why we are here to talk about the convergence of digital and cybersecurity and how we all can help Canada and the larger allied defense ecosystem balance risk with speed, the threats of today against the needs of tomorrow. So on that note, I want to take a few minutes just to talk about the importance of partnerships to drive defense security and innovation. Canadian defense policy seeks to ensure that uniformed personnel have modern tools needed to succeed and return home safely at the end of every mission. Alliances and partnerships are critical enablers of modern defense posture, and they are especially important for driving technology development as well as adoption. A modern defense force must position itself to leverage rapidly evolving technologies in order to actively address evolving threats, keep pace with allies, develop sophisticated awareness, and enable interoperability with allies, partners, including NORAD, NATO, and the Five Eyes community. One of the best ways to rapidly harness and inject new tech into the defense stack is to partner with industry. This includes the defense industrial base, big technology companies, and non-traditional vendors who can move fast and innovate with speed and agility. This is particularly true when we're talking about software, cloud, artificial intelligence, and of course, cyber, where industry is making hundreds of billions of dollars of annual investment with direct applicability to the defense, government, and civilian agencies. And it is important for all of us that our government and our defense organizations leverage that investment and take advantage of it to deliver their own capabilities. We face a significant talent gap as well when it comes to hiring for STEM skills, including computer science, cyber, AI. That means we really need to upskill and reskill government and defense workers to fill that gap. We also need to ensure that less tech-savvy people can make use of low and no-code capabilities to improve their job functions. So we're pleased to offer Microsoft Virtual Training Days for Canada, free classes and certification exams for both technical and non-technical professionals alike, in topics including security, AI, cloud, data fundamentals, and many more. It's critical that we address the role that cybersecurity plays in the defense landscape. We also believe that it is of great responsibility for tech companies to be able to do everything that we can. For example, investing, sharing information, being able to partner with all types of companies in the defense ecosystem to be able to deliver better capability. It's also imperative that we bake in security and resilience right from the start, including the employment of zero trust architectures, modern device management policies, security skilling across the workforce. So while the allied defense ecosystem has a big cybersecurity hill to climb, both from a technology perspective as well from a policy process perspective, I am confident that we'll get there together. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you to the Department of National Defense for emphasizing the critical need for digital transformation and cybersecurity as enablers of future-ready defense ecosystem. From all of us here at Microsoft, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Heiser. Merci beaucoup. Very interesting. And our last speaker, certainly not the least, is Mr. Chris Pogue, CEO of Thales Canada. Un ancien militaire, M. Pogue a rempli plusieurs postes chez Thales, incluant vice-président défense et sécurité. Il a aussi gravi les échelons chez MDA, General Dynamics Mission Systems et CAE. M. Pogue, merci de vous faire vos commentaires. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you to Samuel & Associates and Policy Insights and CDR for pulling us together, and to my previous panelists for their commentary. I won't try to articulate what the 75,000 people in Thales around the world in 68 countries do, but I will point you to our vision of ourselves, building a future we can all trust. Nobody ever builds anything of any value alone, and so it is about collaboration. And that we can trust, I think, is central to the dialogue we've had so far. But I want to allow you just to imagine a slightly different time. Most of us in this room are probably digital immigrants. There's a few that might be digital natives, under 30, but most of us are digital immigrants. A short story, my daughter's not here, so I can tell it, because if she was here, she'd stop me. She's 20. She grew up in a world that was totally digital. She grew up in a world where I don't think she knows her iPhone actually rings, because she doesn't really communicate that way. But I remember one time when she was around 10 or 11, I went in her room, and there was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You all probably remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Psychological needs at the base. Not for her. Wi-Fi was at the base. And I only say that for two things. One, it's maybe a little funny, but two, it's probably reality, in that that was so essential to her. But none of that Wi-Fi or connectivity would be there without it being secure and being safe. This is kind of where we are with digital transformation. If I take you back 20 years, I served on a number of NATO panels. The NATO banner makes me think of it. And one of our panels was on interoperability, when I heard the Deputy Secretary General talk about interoperability. And it was interoperability in multiple fashions. There was joint interoperability between the Army, Navy, and Air Force. There was combined interoperability between a Navy in Canada with a Navy in the US. There was coalitions, multiple nations working together, sometimes ad hoc, sometimes only temporary, and sometimes only for specific missions. And yet we were going to be interoperable. And in these NATO panels, we talked about a lot of technology and a lot of way of moving things, but it came down to one fundamental thing. And that was whether you would believe in withhold by exception or share by exception. And that was with information. And the future security for all of us has to be on a path where it is withhold by exception. And that means, again, it has to be secure. And in that same 20 years from that NATO panel, I've watched the digital transformation occur, and I believe we are at a moment in sort of a nexus of technologies. Big data management is clearly part of everybody's vernacular. Augmented reality and virtual reality. The use of AI, and in many forms and in many fashions. The ability to develop autonomous systems and have autonomy in systems. All connected through high bandwidth, robust, and secure networks. These technologies have been kind of moving along at their own paces, their own hype cycles, if you will, over the past 20 years. They've kind of converged here and now, where they are self-reinforcing and they're building on each other. And I would argue the greatest benefactor in that story is the world of AI. It demands the large data sets. It demands secure connectivity to do what it does. It demands the ability to eventually operate autonomous systems. And when I think of where AI is and how we're applying it, and I think of the fact that not all AI is necessarily created equally, in our world, we're looking at it through the lens of augmented intelligence. How do we use this kind of digital transformation to help humans do what they do better? And when I put that in a military context, I can't help myself but take you back half a century to Colonel Boyd and the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. And if we think of where we put defense forces in conflicts or in difficult situations, they will carry out with their sensors, they'll observe the environment they're in. They'll orient that information. They'll create a decision, and then they'll act on it. And the one thing that the OODA loop was always based on was how fast can you do that? And now when you make digital transformation, the larger volumes of data, the more effective way of bringing data together to allow a human to make that decision, you're actually putting time, if you will, back in the OODA loop. To me, this is where the focus of what our energies are invested in, is putting that time back in those decision cycles. So the decision cycles can be better and faster. I had a conversation a couple of years ago with Admiral Bishop, and at that time he was in CF in Command, and we were talking about the use of data. And one of the points he made I thought was really insightful was he talked about, instead of trying to find the right data to make a decision, why can't we use all the data to make the right decision? And in some respects, that's kind of where we are today. We're at that moment. Now, yes, it has to be secure and it has to be safe. That takes me to the next sort of step in this sort of journey. And that's the step of how will this get deployed? And I'm going to talk about a concept called porous cognitive boundaries. Think about that for a second. Porous cognitive boundaries. We're often locked into the systems we use and the way we operate. Within TELUS, for example, we're working with Microsoft on the Nexium Cloud and Dell. We're working with Google on next generation capability. This was spoken to by our last speaker, for sure. We have to find new partners and new relationships to solve these problems. We won't solve them by ourselves. I think that's a key strength of what we're seeing. The other key strength, I think, is when I looked at within the larger TELUS family, some of the things that are going on, and I thought, well, why can't I have some of that? For example, you may not know this, but TELUS Digital Identity and Security Solutions Group secures $1 trillion a day of electronic transactions around the globe. That's a freaking big number. It's about 80% of the electronic transactions around the globe. 19 of the world's top 20 banks are using that technology to secure their electronic transactions. 3 of the top 5 banks in Canada. So in my simple mind, why can't I have some of that in defense? If I can trust it with my money, why can't I apply it? Now, it's not going to be a lift and shift. It's going to be an adapt and adopt, because defense is going to be different, and it's necessarily different. The consequences, although if it's my money, the consequences are severe, but the consequences of failure are life-threatening. But I do think there's a ton we can do in thinking of these problems through new lenses. And that's shifting our mindset to think about things differently. In the same way that idea of withhold by exception or share by exception shifted our mindset about interoperability. That's how the future will be defined. I will only offer a last couple of thoughts, and it's really around, I think, the emergence of digital platforms as the way we'll make this happen. You may not know this, but the largest company in Canada by market capitalization is Shopify. When I started my digital journey over 20 years ago, they didn't even exist. And now they're the largest company in Canada by market capitalization. And they built a company around a digital platform that allows anybody to connect and sell devices and sell things in a secure and safe manner. So platforms, the power of platforms is something we need to hoist aboard. We certainly are doing that within TELUS with our TELUS Digital Solutions in Montreal, using a digital platform to engage small and medium-sized businesses and startups. In fact, just this year, 450 startups focused on AI came through that process to be down-selected for this year's Season 3 of AI at Centec. We started a new initiative called Talos Synergy, shifting gears somewhat to like, how can we help small and medium-sized businesses to digitize and digitize safely and securely? How can we help them get to that same global market? And we're about to bring the Combat Digital Platform and Nexium Cloud to Canada to allow us to experiment with what might the future combat environment look like? How will it be secure? Test ourselves and ensure that through that, we'll find the solution. I may be a bit of a stoic, I guess, if I think back to Epicurus in terms of, I think the answer to our challenge lies in the problem itself. I fundamentally believe that the development of AI will solve some of our cyber challenges. Imagine a system or a solution that can learn from what's going on, adapt rapidly, make changes, with a human being able to influence that final outcome. So in some respects, I think we are on the cusp of that next nexus, the nexus where AI and probably quantum start to merge in terms of unique solutions for our future. Thank you for the opportunity to share those few thoughts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pogue. And we're very happy to report that during the question and answer period, we're going to have a representative of Boeing, whom I'll introduce at this point. Just to make a quick summary then of our speakers today, Mr. Hyder talked about three things: the speeding up of the digital economy, the China-US digital competition, which actually restricts competition from outside, and the return of industrial policy, which speaks to digital sovereignty. So very interesting comments from him. Callian, again, very interesting there as well. Talked about the portfolio of Callian, of course, but also in the three domains of deter, defend, and counter. In the deter domain, beyond physical attacks, so now digital attacks. And in the defense side, the importance of exercises and training, and I've always said this before the crisis itself, to ensure that there's nothing in crisis that you face that you have not done, prepared for and done exercises and training and education to do. In terms of counter, of course, industry cannot do, so defense has to do it, and the speeding up of the changes and transformation, and some others of our speakers also talked about the speeding up of this changing transformation, and the pain threshold. We're kind of minimizing digital attacks. Satellogic talked about the portfolio of the company and sharing infrastructure. The challenge, of course, sharing infrastructure and satellite infrastructure specifically, the challenge from countries which want to hold that sovereignty. Their operating systems and the regulations that are needed. Again, this topic comes up, industry regulations regarding satellites, and the importance of looking after infrastructure. Microsoft saw that we are at an inflection point, that of course the threat landscape is changing, that our defense force, whatever it will be, needs to be cyber enabled, and the key is the adoption of technology quicker. Data being a strategic asset, and partnerships, and this comes up several times, again, convergence of views here, that partnerships are important, enabling workers at their own level as well, and thinking about security early in any development of platforms and infrastructure. And finally, Talos here with Mr. Pogue, digital natives versus digital immigrants, perhaps some digital dinosaurs as well in certain cases, but the importance of interoperability and information sharing. And in my time in NATO, we always talked about this, whether you actually share by exception or whether you share, actually you protect by exception. And that's exactly right, that we need to withhold by exception. That's a very good point. Technical advances are self-reinforcing. The ODA loop still applies today, and I believe it does, and perhaps it's faster, and it needs to be faster. And this concept of porous cognitive boundaries, which will enhance partnerships again, and ensure that the power of platforms is brought forward. So these are great topics and interesting points. We'll now take a 5-minute break. Je vous remercie beaucoup. Nous allons prendre 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît. Revenez à vos places dans 5 minutes. 5-minute break. Thank you very much. Bienvenue à tous et toutes. We'll now carry on with our roundtable, and once again, we've collated the questions sent in by our registrants, which I'll now pose to our panelists. I'll read the question first and designate which panelist will answer first. If I can, as well, I will redirect to another panelist. Now, apparently we've lost our Argentinian colleague, so we have Ms. Heise and these two gentlemen here who will then take the bulk of the questions, and we may have Boeing pipe in at some point. So we'll adjust on the fly. So you'll see a lot of these questions will model those that happened, those that were posed yesterday to our political military panel, and that's for a very good reason, that we want to kind of get a sense of whether there's a convergence of views here, or whether, and what are the subtleties, the different subtleties between political, military, and industrial issues. So the first question concerns, naturally, the threat. Since no nation or organization has complete dominance over cyberspace, it's critical to identify emerging threats to North America and Europe, and how industries, sectors, and innovating companies are supporting Western democracy. Given this context, what would each of you describe as the biggest impact on your industry and company of the convergence of digitalization and cyber technologies? I'm first going to ask Ms. Heise from Microsoft to give us an answer. Ms. Heise.
Thank you. There are so many examples of how digitalization, information, and cyber are used to really undermine security and stability. Some recent examples, which I know had personal effects on me and a lot of people, was the ransomware attacks against the gas pipelines. There was 40, 50 cars in line at every gas station in Northern Virginia because of it. The disinformation campaigns for elections and the weaponization of social media. If you haven't read the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, I do recommend that you at least read the executive summary. The full report is over 100 pages, and it's a little bit lengthy if you don't really love that type of reading. But the executive summary is well worth it, because it gives you a sense of the significant volume of attacks that happen every single day. It's like 24 trillion daily security signals are processed by Microsoft. 9 billion endpoint threats are blocked. And it also talks about a lot of the motivations of the adversaries. I mentioned this earlier. As a tech company, we believe the tech industry has a real responsibility to help protect critical infrastructure and systems against this threat, and to serve up technology solutions to customers that work to protect and defend the freedoms that we all enjoy. I think there's two aspects relative to paths to success that I touched on in my opening remarks, but I just want to highlight again because I think it's so critically important. Partnerships. Partnerships can be a force multiplier, and I talked about it from a capability perspective, but one aspect that I think we really need to discuss as an industry, as well as across allied nations, is acquisition reform and the ability to procure in different ways that allows agility and speed. And then the second is upskilling. I talked about upskilling initiatives and specifically the tech gap for cybersecurity. But it was mentioned earlier in one of the earlier sessions that this also requires a different outlook on education and being able to light that STEM spark, if you will, in children at a very young age. And so ensuring that computer science and tech education are part of the core curricula, those are key ways that we'll be able to, together as an industry, better fight these adversaries.
Thank you. Mr. Pogue, would you also add your comments to this?
I'll just pick up maybe on a couple of the comments she just finished with. I think the education, one of the challenges we face for sure is in the cyber defense world is getting the right talent, and there's no question that it is a highly sought after capability. And so the sooner we can inculcate people with this is important to their security, it's important to their nation, the better. So we're kind of almost trying to grow our own sometimes because of that dynamic. A couple of the other things I think that maybe are worth touching on is within the broader Thales group, we have groups that are dedicated to cyber defense and cybersecurity. We have a cyber defense solutions group, a cloud protection and licensing group, and a digital identity group, as I mentioned earlier, all providing varying approaches and levels of cybersecurity to customers and to ourselves. In fact, thankfully, we use our own technology on our own security, which I think is an important piece of the puzzle. An area that's particularly intriguing to me when we think of cybersecurity, and we often think of it in terms of the information security and data breaches, is the number of systems, operational technology systems in factories and traffic lights, power plants that are all on a network that are equally vulnerable. And they're not talking to anybody, they're moving data around. And that whole OT security domain is one that worries me. Because like Kevin's comments about if the warriors were coming to our border, we'd be reacting differently. I fear that there's warriors potentially inside our borders already in some of these companies as they move to the Internet of Things, which they want to do for all the efficiencies that can be gained. But there are embedded threats. I just think of the example, we have the Joint Supply Ship program that we deliver today. And the example of if someone were to come on board with a malware USB stick and stick it in somewhere in that ship, you potentially could be weeks or months before that threat was found. And that ship could be at sea in a dangerous environment. So those are the kind of things that sort of keep me awake and worry me for sure.
Thank you. And the next question is for Mr. Ford. The threat exists in part because of the convergence of digitalization and cyber technologies coming together. What approaches has your company taken to mitigate this impact? Thank you.
Well, I think to me, I think we can all appreciate, I talk about complexity in running organizations these days, and that doesn't matter if you're public, private, government, defense. When I look at governance, risk, and compliance, what I call GRC Italian, what I've done is I've looked at cyber, but you also have to look at compliance, you have to look at privacy, you have to look at incident response, you have to look at business continuity, you have to look at ESG. All of these things in the digitization is not one independent of each other. So when you govern, and what I'm trying to do is evolve our governance Italian and establish a governance risk and committee function, a governance risk and compliance function, because the complexity as a CEO of the company, I can't deal with all that independently. I need a cohesive strategy. That's just us as a company in what protecting our walls. We offer cyber services to our customers. We develop ground systems for satellites. We have health tech platforms. So how am I ensuring that the confidence that the customers have in us is not eroded by the fact that we're not just protecting our own walls, we're protecting theirs? So I can tell you, when I go to bed at night and think about GRC, I call it, I drive my company crazy right now, GRC, GRC, GRC. It's the reality though. It's my responsibility as CEO to ensure that all of those, what I call bubbles in that GRC, are taken care of. So the digitization is just only making it more complex.
Okay, and Mr. Pogue, do you want to add to that from Thales' point of view?
I think I share a lot of Kevin's concerns for sure. I think maybe one of the things I'll pick up on the convergence is, and maybe I commented on it earlier, is there isn't going to be any slowdown in data volume. I read somewhere that by 2025 there'll be 200 plus zettabytes in cloud storage. I have no idea what a zettabyte is. I haven't got a clue. But there's a lot of zeros after a one. And it's big. It's big. If I had 200 zettabytes in my bank account, I'd probably be happy. My crypto account. So it's not going to get easier. And so, as I mentioned sort of in the closing comments, and I think we've got to find a way to vector some energy on the technology that is causing the increase in this volume to be equally able to solve the security issues with the increase in the volume. Not sure if that made any sense, but I think the idea that AI is being applied to help make more effective and better decisions, but it can also be applied to deal with some of the cyber threats as that larger and larger data sets are moving around. So it's the convergence in of itself is where the answer lies. I think the point made earlier too is our ability to share experiences. One of the fundamental principles of building a world we can all trust is that last word, trust. And one of the ways we were successful in interoperability in missions, notwithstanding all the challenges we had when I was in uniform, was we developed trust. And so as a collective industry, and eventually in the broader whole of government, there has to be a mechanism of trust. Otherwise, this cyber problem is not, it's an intractable problem. We will not solve it.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to Ms. Heise regarding the mitigation efforts to these threats and concerning specifically the possible role of government in this. Can government provide leadership and assistance to industry to help in these mitigation efforts?
Thank you. Yes, I absolutely do believe it is a problem that we all have to tackle. I do think the government has some responsibility relative to the right policies and procedures and ensuring that we are all communicating and collaborating and being able to share information in a secure and trusted manner on these sometimes very sensitive topics. I'll go back to partnership, and this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I really do believe that what I've seen in my career of helping broader corporations deal with cybersecurity issues is even competitors need to share information relative to cyber threats, right? It makes them stronger if they're able to do that, if they're able to collaborate. And I think partnership and collaboration and sharing of that cybersecurity information is absolutely critical. We are partnered with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity within the communications establishment and provide security operations capabilities for the government of Canada, which I think is a great step in the right direction to continue to expand that partnership and be able to deliver strength through partnership. The other thing that at Microsoft that we're doing to try to mitigate is, I think we announced, maybe as a couple months ago, that we are investing over $20 billion over the next 5 years to accelerate improved cybersecurity outcomes for all of our customers by focusing on integrating cybersecurity by design. So implementing things like zero trust architectures, to work with open source communities, to be able to help defense organizations with their digital transformations, and then also just being able to have a dialogue with where we started of making recommendations of different policies and processes we've seen other governments take and steps and measures that we think actually help strengthen a nation's cybersecurity posture.
Yeah, thank you. And in fact, it's not really a broken record because all our speakers, I think, did mention partnerships right from the beginning. Mr. Hyder talked about the importance of partnerships between government and industry. Mr. Ford, do you want to add a few comments to that?
Well, I think to me, you know, there's the digital transformation happening, and then our ability as humans to change our behavior dealing with the reality. And you know, defense and security, and I've been in this industry a long time, we're not great at sharing. As a publicly traded company, imagine if I said, hey, we've just been attacked and here's what happened, the whole kit. Like, it's hard to get past the reality of the impact of that statement to your company. So we have to be brave and start doing that. Because if we don't do that, whether it's government, industry, defense, we're just letting the bad guys in and the bad gals in. So we got to come culturally. There's a cultural shift here that needs to change on the context of that data exchange, number one. Number two, I mentioned earlier the ability to train and be ready. I was serious about that. You know, we train organizations around the world. We train NATO. It's the ability to rehearse something when you have an opportunity to actually get the threat in and actually work through your processes and attack before it actually happens is invaluable. And I, as mentioned earlier, with government, think we can learn a lot. We have flooding in BC right now, fires. You just named the physical issues we're dealing with all the time and all the best practices that we are creating to deal with the physical threats. Where are those best practices being applied in the cyber world, and how do we share those, and how do we actually participate in those as industry? So complete sharing, but culturally, it's human behavior. We just got to keep being brave, and collectively, I think we can get there.
Mr. Pope, go
Yeah,
ahead.
Kevin's, I mean, I think the vision that Kevin's articulating is worth the energy. I think there's probably some interim steps along the way. I mean, what struck me is that, the zero trust, I think, is a key capability that all industry players in defense ought to be deploying. I mean, it's just a fundamental mindset shift that I think adds a layer of security. So if you're not, you ought to. I think Kevin's comment earlier in his opening remarks is also worth touching on. Your cyber health organization. I think there's a mechanism by which industry and government could create a mechanism by which cyber attacks were anonymous, and you could still learn from each other. There's probably a mechanism. And so that you're not sort of opening your corporate kimono and saying, look at me, I'm in trouble. You're sharing it in a best practice kind of a mindset. I would also propose that we seriously look at the threat of cyber. When you attack the Newfoundland hospital system, right? Like, this is our friends and neighbors. And so at the Canada level, we ought to look at this and say, cyber is something we collectively have to share. So if we're thinking about a future competition in the military, we have to find some way to take cyber off the table. We're not going to compete around cyber. It's going to be fait accompli. It's going to be defined in some fashion. And so that's no longer an issue we compete over. We compete over how we deploy other digital technologies, our effectiveness of our AI, or whatever you want, but find a way to make cyber a non-rated criteria in competition. I think, I'm probably crazy what I just said, but that would be something that I think we ought to talk about.
So let's pursue this whole question of the role of government and talk maybe now about the defending critical infrastructure and supporting industry in that manner. Perhaps, Ms. Heiser, you could comment on this, on the defense aspect.
Yeah, so I think a couple things relative to, I talked a little bit about legislation and policies and the different regulations that are needed. The other aspect that we absolutely have to discuss, and I think was mentioned a little bit here, is the enforcement, right? The enforcement of cybersecurity laws and policies and really driving accountability. I think that's important not only for governments, but also to help protect commercial interests as well. And we need support across federal, state, local governments, as well as industry, so that we can ensure that we hold those adversaries accountable as much as we can.
Thank you. Mr. Pogue, you want to answer?
Yeah, I think government obviously can play a role. I mean, I'm going to reflect on the comment from the government representation of the Cyber Center yesterday in the panels. I do think maybe part of the journey is having really clear and well-defined standards for what we're going to have for cybersecurity. Having kind of a base level performance metric that you would expect if you want to participate in any government program, and be able to demonstrate that base level of support. And that base level probably starts at zero trust. And then that's a mechanism by which the cyber issue is sort of more dealable. The other thing I think that governments can play a significant role on is probably facilitating the cyber health thing we just talked about, creating a mechanism by which you engage industry in a broad possible fashion. And I think then that the different industry players, depending on scale, can help facilitate that within the larger small and medium-sized business sector across Canada. Like, it may not be known to this audience, but 90% of the Canadian defense sector is delivered by small and medium-sized businesses. Like, it's enormous. And I suspect if we think we're vulnerable, I can only imagine how vulnerable they feel. And so there's an outreach that I think government can help facilitate that way too, because these folks are going to be in your supply chain, or they're going to be in your innovation cycle. And so I think we have a responsibility there as well.
Thank you. Mr. Ford, go ahead.
Great points. The one thing I don't think we've talked about over the last 2 days, and I'm living it every day, is we've talked about the ecosystem of defense and security. And I can tell you right now, every bid that we're involved with as Calian has got a massive compliance table with regard to either CMMC or NIST, the standards. And for us as a $500 million company, it's not insignificant to be able to step up to those standards. And Canada, I know, was working with the US. I'm sitting on a bunch of different panels and how we ensure that, you know, if we're working through all that, how does that small medium enterprise actually stay in the supply chain when that now becomes a mandatory requirement? And that's what I saw yesterday with that discussion around you are only as strong as your weakest link. So what's happening now, people are in governments and defense, we're trying to run that right through our supply chain, which is, I get it. But I can tell you right now, I do worry about our small medium enterprise capability to run as hard as it's coming, and it's coming fast, the implementation of these standards and the ability for the small medium enterprise to actually step up and meet them. Are we going to start cutting out SMEs from this ecosystem because they just don't have the capacity to actually build in the processes and tools and technologies to demonstrate compliance to these standards? So I think it's one we have to keep looking, and I'm looking at, I keep thinking about standard light and how do you actually move that up depending on that company size. But I know right now that is a major issue for a lot of companies, and I'm hoping with government how they can help is continue the dialogue and making sure we don't shut out the innovation that we're going to need to actually defend cyber in the future.
So the next topic is kind of working with foreign partners and, you know, the way that you protect. It's recently been reported that the U.S. intelligence community has published advice for tech companies that wish to do business with foreign partners like Russia and China. The issue, I guess, is how do you protect intellectual property? How do you protect against cyber attacks and data theft when you're working with foreign partners? Perhaps I can ask this time to Mr. Pogue to go ahead and start the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have all the internal processes that you would have no matter where you were operating. You can't sort of change the rules when you want to operate internationally. The business I'm directly responsible for example, does export from Canada into the global world, particularly around rail signaling. And so we have to ensure if you're going to get on that train and that the signaling is being used to optimize the capacity on the train and its effectiveness in getting you to the destination you want to get to, we have to know that that's safe and secure. And so even to Kevin's point about the small to medium-sized business supply chain across Canadian programs, that extends when you think about where you fit in someone else's supply chain globally. It's hard to fathom what it'll look like when you're trying to do business in China or trying to do business in Russia or countries where there is this certainly this challenge, but you kind of don't have a choice because the cyber issue will kill people if you don't sort of address it.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Heise, perhaps you can give us the view from Microsoft's point of view.
Yeah, so ironically, I'm at the NATO Industry Forum I spoke at yesterday and have been here today. And a lot of these topics have been discussed here, including the information sharing across nations. And one of the things that I would offer is that I know it's uncomfortable, whether it be companies, right, that compete with each other to share information, nations, there's a lot of blockers and challenges with being able to share what may be sensitive information to be able to try to battle this adversary. But I think we have to look at it from a risk perspective because the risk is much greater if we don't. And so we need to take on a better understanding of what's the opportunity for us to find some sort of mechanism, some sort of secure, trusted mechanism that we can share information, that we can become stronger together, as opposed to not sharing, and then we are all vulnerable. And we have to recognize that not pushing through these blockers is a decision in itself and maybe putting us all at greater risk.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask Mr. Ford to comment as well, but before I do, please prepare your questions. We'll have time for a couple of questions from the audience in person here. So go ahead, Mr. Ford.
You know, I think the word that I keep hearing in all the dialogue over the last couple of days, the word trust. You know, the Deputy Secretary General in NATO, and you know, how proud are we to be part of NATO's Canada and all the work that's going on in that forum and in a trust environment. You know, we build components that go into military vehicles. We build components that go into ground systems for satellites. Our supply chain is global. And we import from just about every country in the world, and we export just about every other country in the world. What was identified in COVID, I think, was that on a critical area for our country, we let slip our ability to manufacture. And I think in areas such as this, when we talk about that, I think there has to be trust, absolutely. But I think for our critical infrastructure, we have to have an honest discussion about how much we have capability to do in-house versus being dependent, because as long as we're dependent, we're always going to be susceptible. I also believe that, frankly, from my viewpoint, the success will be based on trust, but it has to still be around a common goal and a common strategy. And I still believe we have work to do on just the strategy element of this, let alone the tactical execution.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Okay, comments from any questions from our audience here? Please raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. Rick Petrie.
So I have a question, I think for Chris, but hopefully others can also chime in. Perhaps you can speak a bit more where the human in the loop needs to be in the highly complex but error-prone decision cycle. How do we foster greater trust in automation to accelerate data-heavy analysis so we allow more time for the slower but more critical human decision-making?
I think fundamental to our whole idea of applying, if you allow me to apply it to the AI domain in particular, fundamental to our whole idea in that domain is this idea of true AI, trusted AI. And so we don't use the phrase across TELUS of artificial, we use it as augmented consciously. So it's augmented intelligence, not artificial. There's nothing artificial about it. And it's to help a human make a more effective decision. So it is sort of in the DNA of the way we think about applying AI to the problems we want to solve. And we're not going to apply AI to because you're going to find AI it's ubiquitous, right? It's in all kinds of places. We're focused on decision systems, critical decision systems within that larger context, and where a human has to make a decision under chaos, stress, and complexity. And true AI is kind of what we hang our heart on in terms of how we would design that. So it is very much a human-centric approach. You know, as I've kind of gathered more and more intel on this, I look at it and I've read some articles that suggest the biggest bang for your AI buck is where it's helping a human do something. And so in some respects, that's kind of just fundamental to the way we look at it. Your second part of your question is how do we put more time back in? I think as AI algorithms, increasingly learn more and more, and we are able to develop them, you will start to see, if you picture like AI development against time, you'll start to see time added back in. Now, the whole OODA loop story that we talked about earlier, because they'll be able to deal with more complexity and more information. So it is a journey. It's not even a destination.
I would love to hear Ms. Haida's comments on this, because you talked in your opening remarks about training in people at different levels and so on, and so the human in the loop here. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll actually give an example that kind of goes to what his remarks were that he just made. So at Microsoft, we use artificial intelligence to sort through all those cybersecurity alerts and alarms. And, as you can imagine, when you're being constantly bombarded and attacked, whether it's Microsoft or I've also seen it at defense organizations for like their network management. But with cybersecurity, we use AI to be able to sort through all that noise, right? To be able to allow that cybersecurity specialist, that talent, to be able to focus on the right areas. And so to bring it back to the skilling and the talent, right? I absolutely I want to make sure that our cyber specialists aren't spending their time on sorting through a bunch of alarms or noise. I want them to really be doing the analysis. And quite honestly, that's what they want to be doing too. They don't want to be doing the more mundane efforts when we can automate that. And I think that is critical to talent retention, as well as being able to make some of these tasks significantly more manageable for that human and make them a lot more effective in their job.
Okay, thank you. We have another question over here.
Good morning, Andre Dupuis from Space Strategies Consulting. I have a bunch of questions, but one of them is about SMEs, one of them is about securing data, but the one that I think maybe is best suited to today focuses around the big picture. My last ops job, great job, I was the Canadian colonel responsible for the NORAD Northcom Command Center. At a time when we integrated those two command centers. Cyber, to me, was a warfare domain that was just coming into its own. Cyber as a warfare domain was interesting, but not compelling from my perspective. Neither was the air domain, neither was the land domain, neither was the maritime domain, neither was the space domain. What was compelling was the integration of the cyber, the space, the air, the maritime, and the land domain. My view at the end of the conference is we have talked very much about cyber either as a transport layer to everything else or a warfare domain in and of itself, but very little discussion around integration and what does it mean. If I'm sitting in the command center and I have to make a decision, is North America under attack? The tools I had at the time were, is it an air attack or is it a maritime event? But it was never, is it an integrated? The little bit that might be happening in cyber, the little bit that might be happening in space, the little bit that might be happening in the land domain need to be integrated. To me, that's the big challenge. It's not these in silos, but it's what do we do to cross those silos? Because I have to tell you, I didn't have those tools. I would be surprised if those tools exist today. So, comment maybe?
Go ahead, Kevin.
It's a great question, and somebody's been this, we've talked about that cross-domain awareness for years with regard to the physical land, sea, and air. And from my viewpoint, what cyber is, and even in our business, it rips through everything that we do. Let's talk about healthcare. Let's talk about SATCOM. Let's talk about an attack in the context of a defense attack, but what about that attack on Newfoundland? Is that a defense attack? So from my viewpoint, that awareness, and I talked about detect in my opening comments, is I think there's going to have to be a lot of work done. And that's a great opportunity for us to share, because I need the same dashboard running my company. It's no longer just about defending our country, it's about defending our way of life. So we need to talk about these dashboards and actually let them know we run a threat risk assessment and a security operations center for our customers, where we're trying to actually pull out those vulnerabilities and let them know it's coming before it hits. So I think there's lots of work to be done, and we're still trying to figure out the physical domain awareness, and this thing's going to rip right through it if we don't figure this out.
Chris?
Don't disagree with that. I'm going to try to tackle what I perceive you defined your need as when you were in the Ops Center. And we would have, when I was in the Air Force, we would have got like a common operating picture of some kind. But the common operating picture of today, and even the recent past, and certainly of tomorrow, is a common operating picture that isn't just spatially oriented things. It's spectral information, because there's information coming from different types of sources. It has a temporal domain in it, because things are changing over time, and as an operation person, you want to understand, is that just a blip, or is that moving closer to me or moving away? There's a bunch of different domains. When we add what will be, I believe, the next revolution in sensors, quantum sensors of that dynamic, you'll have another entirely different domain of magnetic characteristics of an object that will now be part of that common operating picture. So when we used to talk COPS, or common operating picture, or recognized maritime picture, the word picture was somewhat trapping in its language, because it made you think you could look at something on a screen, right? And you know well, it's multi-layered. And this is where The integration will be in the multi-ways that multi-layer of data is integrated together into a view that a decision maker says, yes, that's a real threat. And not just on one piece of data, but on multiple synced data over time, over space, over spectrum, and even over magnetic characteristics.
Ms. Heiser, sorry.
Helpful or worse?
Ms. Heiser, would you like to comment on the integration piece here?
Absolutely. So I will say this comes up in every defense organization around the globe that I speak to for allied defense, multi-domain integration, and the need to be able to have a pathway to get there. I think the gentleman is right relative to we're not there yet. We have a long ways to go, and different organizations are in different phases of that path, of that journey. And so 2 points I'd like to make. One is it's really critical to know where you're at on that journey, right? So if you look at the digital maturity model, you think of it from an analog, advanced, digital, disruptive, right? To be able to get that multi-domain, it's really in that disruptive phase. And most organizations are quite honestly in lots of different those phases at one time, because we have very complex defense organizations. And so we have to target that end capability and ensure that our execution plans to get there helps deliver what he just asked for, because that will be a game changer. The second is what I see every customer struggling with and trying to implement, which is the right first step, is to put a secure, interoperable digital backbone that is resilient as a very first way to start, so they can ensure that that multi-domain information, that data, is able to be shared across that plane of that digital maturity model. And I think once we make progress, we will start to be able to deliver some of those end capabilities that kernel needs.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question.
Hi, Goran Pesic, CEO of Samuel Associates. Thank you very much for your excellent exchange of ideas today. I would like to move our discussion in the area of government procurement. Yesterday, officials were talking about the notion that we need to be faster, more agile, and more aligned with the government's priorities. I just want to take your sort of perspectives on what you think from your particular business point of view is required or is lacking in order to help accelerate that agile procurement model. Thank you.
So another little personal story. So just before I left the military, one of the last assignments I had was on an ADM material team where we were tasked, the title of our project was procurement reform. It was getting it right in 30% less time. That was the goal. We didn't succeed. We didn't get it right, and we didn't do it faster. Because we were really focused in on how would we use simulation to allow us to evaluate things in a more effective way. So maybe we got trapped by a really cool piece of technology, and it was still a really cool piece of technology, and still is. Coming to Thales, I've had the unique opportunity to experience the Aegis contract, the Arctic Offshore Patrol Vessel Joint Supply Ship In-Service Support Program. That is an acronym within an acronym within an acronym. But what's nice about that program, it is a different kind of contract. Right, so a relational contract, which is designed to allow increased flexibility, and it's performance-based. So it's not about delivering on requirements that were defined 10 years ago. It's about delivering a level of performance, and industry and our partners, and we have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses involved in that program, are encouraged to innovate as a way to deliver greater value. And if you do deliver greater value, both you and the government benefit from that. So to me, if only I had known about relational contract when I was on that getting it right in 30% less time, maybe that's what we would have tried. So what's thankful, though, is in that intervening 18 or so years, some folks came up with a good idea. And we really need to embrace that, because to me, there can be additional procurement tweaks and reforms, and there ought to be. But if you try relational contracting and performance-based metrics, you're going to love it, because I think that's where innovation is. That's where the future is. It's not easy. Like, this isn't like a freebie, because you're now interacting with your customer and the public service, PSPC, in a different way. But that's where change happens. Thanks for that question, though. That was a good one.
Mr. Ford, you want to add to this?
Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I referred to that in the procurement reform. Mr. referred to it yesterday, and I've been doing this a long time. I'm not as, maybe I'm older than I look, but the reality is, to me, I still feel like we're trying to take a system and evolve it to deal with the new reality. Is it time to maybe take a step back and say, what's going to disrupt how we do this? We announced yesterday with LSpark here in Canada, you know, an incubation hub for health tech technology with our healthcare platform. We did that in weeks. Weeks. It's not taking that engine that's been running at that 90 kilometers per hour and figuring out how to add more pistons to it. Maybe we need to take a step back and have dialogue with government. And I know those dialogues have happened. I know government's working on this as an ex-government employee. But I still feel we keep trying to take that system and make it go faster. And I'm wondering if it's time we take a step back and say, what can we do, maybe in pieces or incremental chunks, to disrupt how we think about this? Because we've been trying, I've been doing this a long time, we've been trying for years, and again, our government colleagues are working so hard to, because they get it, they don't want to be buying technology that's 10 years old. They understand the challenge. So how do we disrupt it, would be my question. Let's have a dialogue around that, not how do we continue to evolve a process that's been around for hundreds of years, it feels like some days.
I'm going to ask Ms. Heiser to comment, but first there's another burning question that I will get somebody to pose, because he won't leave me alone unless I do. But Ms. Heiser, go ahead and comment, please.
I'll do it quickly so you can get to them. There's two things that I think that are key. It depends on what we're trying to buy. We really need to have some dialogue and finding best practices of what that is. I've seen some very successful acquisition processes when you're trying to procure software development factories, where it's not a long procurement cycle. It's not about what kind of proposal you can write. It is about watching a team of developers that's going to come work for you, how they can work together as a team, how much they can access and efficiently use commercial technology to be able to, in sometimes 4 hours, sometimes 8 hours, be able to put together and deliver a actual software capability that you can use. And that's a really effective way to be able to buy those types of services. That won't work for everything. The second one that I've seen that has been very successful, a lot of times in the acquisition process, everybody has to become silent. We can't continue with our conversations. We can't continue the dialogue. And what that ends up happening is, in my opinion, limiting the types of innovation that the customers get in the long run. Some of the customers I've worked with in the past have ran workshops during the entire procurement cycle, which was unbelievably helpful to really get to a level of detail to ensure that we were proposing exactly what we wanted them, what they needed, as well as we could be very clear on what we could or couldn't do, and they can make those trade-offs as we go. So those are two examples that I think can and should be adopted, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. We have to come up with a set of processes that work depending on what you're buying.
Thank you. So General Pitzel with the last question.
Thank you, Michelle. Jerry Pitzel, Samuel Associates. I'd first like to thank all of our speakers today for the excellent work they've done and the panorama of issues they've raised. I will sort of switch this to your big thinking cap as CEOs of defense contractors. What approach do your companies take to accountability in respect of your shareholders, in respect of your clients, when faced with a cyber attack and your response to it? And what portion of that accountability would you share with government?
So I'm going to start with Mr. Ford, because you talked about being in a publicly traded company now, and how that was a kind of an eye-opener for you. So start with that.
Well, I think to me, if you go back to that, detect, defend, and So clearly, from my viewpoint, the job number one is to not let it happen to my company and not let it happen to my customers. So, we continue to invest in both headcount and staff and technology to try and make that happen. And it's a daily discussion, it feels like most days, on that, because it is a changing landscape almost daily. And if you just watch any new cyber attack, I always ask my team, what's happening? Where are you? So number one, I owe it to my shareholders, my customers, to make sure we're doing everything we can to actually be ready and to prevent and detect. The other one is response. There's going to be new legislation soon, I believe, on having to disclose cyber attacks. So that accountability will be falling upon companies like ours with regard to that can no longer be the thing that you keep in the back room somewhere. It's going to be out there. And I think in many ways, as painful as that will be for a lot of companies, it will help facilitate this information exchange with regard to the fact that something's happening to that company. Let's make sure it's not happening to ours. And then with government itself, I think for us, we just got to keep working with them on where we have shared, like we do a lot of work in customer sites on government premises. So whose responsibility is it in those scenarios with regard to ensuring that work can go on in a cyber protected way, especially in a COVID world? We have so many people working virtually right now. So I think there's dialogue, but there's going to be policy. But right now, believe me, I take it as a personal responsibility to make sure that is something we're doing the best we can for our customers, shareholders, and our stakeholders as far as government.
Thank you. Ms. Heiser, you go next, please.
Absolutely. And I said it before, but technology companies, we believe, should absolutely hold themselves responsible for helping not only protect their own companies, but their customers. And that includes the government organizations that we do business with every day. And I do believe there's an opportunity for not only our customers, but also for our partners to be able to leverage commercial technologies and commercial resources to be able to strengthen the security of their businesses as well. Absolutely empathize with the gentleman talking about, small and medium-sized companies. This can be crushing. And so it's really important that they take advantage of cloud and some of the security products that are available so that it can be a little bit more manageable. It is a huge focus for our corporation, and it's something that we take very seriously. Our motto is that we run on trust, and we try to live that every day.
Thank you. Mr. Pogue, last word.
I would echo the comments made. I mean, our motto is building a future we can all trust, so it has to be trustworthy. We have a very robust corporate governance and responsibility model within the broader TELUS. Personally, I think full transparency with our customers is crucial. Maybe it's because I come from the defense world and I realize our business in Canada goes beyond defense, but the people we serve are the people I served with. And so at the end of the day, I feel a really commitment and responsibility to them. Even they may not be directly in line with that. So I think the policy that's coming, I think is fantastic, because I think that policy potentially creates a mechanism by which this other thing we talked about, this health organization, cyber health thing, can become more paramount.
Well, gentlemen, lady, thank you very much for your help here and for your participation. Your remarks and answers to questions have helped us gain a greater understanding of the issues and added to the political and military discussion that we had yesterday. So a great kind of bringing together. Once again, thank you for giving your time, your energy, and your intelligence. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Don't vote for Ford.
Alors, mesdames et messieurs, nous voici arrivés à la fin de ce sommet. Merci à vous tous pour cette deuxième excellente matinée de discussion sur un sujet d'importance primordiale. Alors, de mon côté, je veux remercier Goran Pesek et Monsieur Brett Kitchen pour l'opportunité de modérer ce sommet. Félicitations à toute l'équipe et en particulier, je veux reconnaître Mademoiselle Aliénor Perfit, l'adjointe de M. Pezic, qui s'est donnée entièrement à ce projet. Merci beaucoup, Aliénor, pour toute l'aide que tu nous as donnée. I'll now turn it over to our co-host, Mr. Brett Kitchen, publisher of Canadian Defence Review magazine, to close off the summit. Thank you.
Thanks, General. So first, I would like to thank everyone who took the time to register for the event and spend their busy schedule with us over the past 2 days. The conversations have been fascinating, and we feel that this event will help shape future discussions in a meaningful way. As General Maisonneuve said earlier, with no nation or organization having dominance over cyberspace, it has become evident that in the interest of peace, security, and economic stability, there is a clear need for summits like this that bring together prominent and influential leaders to address the emerging threats to North America and Europe. With that said, CDR will be utilizing some of the outcomes and lessons learned from this summit to help shape our editorial focus over the next 12 to 18 months here. So be sure to check in with CDR regularly for content focusing on digital transformation as well as cyber warfare. With that said, I would like to take a moment to thank Mr. Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada, for his time and opening statement today, as well as all of our speakers, both virtual and in attendance here, for donating their time. Second to that, I would also like to thank General Maisonneuve for being our summit chair, as well as Deputy Chair and Samuel Associates CEO, Mr. Goran Samuel Pesek, for ensuring that the last 2 days ran smoothly. Thanks, guys. Finally, in closing, I would like to thank our title sponsor, NATO, as well as Thales, for their support of the event, as well as our sponsors, without whom the event would not be possible. General Dynamics Mission Systems, Calian, and our technology partner, Modestry, with their Distantly platform, as well as DAFOCOM and Neptune Cyber. Thanks again for being part of this one-of-a-kind event. Best wishes and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.
The physical world and the digital world are no longer two separate things. All of the physical things that drive our nation forward now operate in the digital world. This is the cyber domain. And there are so many benefits. The ability to connect, to communicate, to collect, analyze, and share information anytime, anywhere. But with these benefits come threats. General Dynamics Mission Systems Canada is uniquely positioned to usher in the future of cybersecurity, helping governments protect their citizens and operate securely in the cyber domain. We understand that cyber protection requires always-on, active monitoring of the entire domain. Dynamic protection built into key components in critical operations. Defensive systems that actively learn and autonomously respond to keep us one step ahead of the threats. There is simply no one product or technology that can do all of this. The problem space is more complex than that. This means understanding the operation or mission first before selecting the right technologies and partners so that integrated solutions are relevant and adaptable. As a systems integrator, General Dynamics has the experience and leadership to help governments build smarter and more robust cyber ecosystems. We've been doing exactly that for decades, so we're ready. Ready to match the threat with experience, commitment, and agility. Ready to collaborate with governments, academia, and industry for best-of-breed technology. Ready to deliver innovation through sovereign, integrated cyber solutions. We're ready to defend Canada and its allies from cyber threats today and in the future.